Welcome back to another episode of Practice Underwater. And this is definitely one where if you didn't listen to part one, please go back to last week. This is part two of our interview with Keith. This is our director of coaching, Suzanne Rassi, is taking over this interview. We did like a longer introduction last time and a longer outro, really, kind of explaining the shift in Practice Underwater to kind of correspond with our shift in the coaching department. And I mean, you don't have to listen to it again, but this one I'd really highly suggest. Matt, can you also encourage our listeners to listen to last week's episode?
Yes, please listen. Is that enough?
This is the level of enthusiasm I get from Matt on certain things. It's tough to be with sometimes.
No, so, it really like you really need to listen to that for this one to make sense. For like jumping into this without any context would be you'd be very confused.
So I'll catch you guys up. If you listened to it last week, or if you just like, you know what, I'm not going to go back. Like, just stop telling me to go back. I'm listening.
Some people just don't like to be told what to do.
Like, I'm not being told what to do. I'm listening to this one without going back. So if that's you, or if you, that's me too, obviously. Or if for whatever reason you need a quick recap, I'll give you a quick recap. So this guy Keith, he did a ground up build, a 6-operatory ground up build, 3.5 years ago. He works 5 days a week clinically. He has 2.5 hygienists and a 3-day-a-week associate. And he is strapped. I mean, it's funny. You'll hear it in this interview, but his doctor schedule is actually not that far booked out. But his hygiene schedule is slammed, and nobody can get in. His practice can't grow anymore, and he's super stressed clinically, and he wants to drop days. He says he can't be present for his kids. He says he can't work on his practice. He's just 5 days clinically for an owner of a growing practice is way too much. And so we talk a lot about in the outro of part one how he needs to step back clinically and really work on his business. And it puts itself in a difficult situation for part two because we just said that, right? But like, he can't do anything about it yet. And part two of Practice Underwater, the format is that we show him all the opportunities for him to grow his practice. But it's funny because he can't do any of them right now because he's so busy clinically that he can't actually work on his practice. And so part of me felt like that this interview needed that type of context before it got started, because Suzanne is going to point to like, hey, your overdue recare process, your AR, your diagnosis. There's so many areas he has to work on, yet he can't work on any of them because he's so busy clinically. And I think this really lends itself to the philosophy that we always say of like, your practice grows so much faster when you are in the right headspace and mindset to actually work on it. And if he had, let's say he was working 3 days a week and he either had a second associate working 2 or 3 days, or his current associate picked up more hours, he would be in a much better place mentally, and his practice would be doing way more production collections. And then he would inherently just make more money and work less and be more, comfortable and profitable and the whole thing. And so I think this is a perfect example of how, just the value that, proper, clinical hours and working on your business can really have for the entire practice.
I think this is going to be a great one to do an update interview in a couple months when he finally does drop clinically, and how his life and practice changed because of it. And like using all of the tactile feedback that Suzanne gives him in this part, this practice is going to look totally different in 6 months if he does this.
And so there's two things that you're going to notice from this part. One, I mean, I was listening to it thinking, it's all great and good that he's like, we're telling him all the stuff to do, but like, he can't do any of it. So until he fixes his practice, until he fixes his clinical workload and like his stress levels and stuff, he'll probably have to come back and listen to this to hear what she's saying.
Yeah.
But I think for our listeners, the one thing you're going to get from this interview is all the things that we've never given you on Practice Underwater. So Suzanne's going to talk about, and it's cool because she, there's a point here, and we'll talk about it a little more in the outro, where she talks about diagnosis as a non-dentist. It's really cool hearing her have that conversation. And then the other thing you're going to hear is you're going to hear her talking about like very specific, like where people are sitting in the front desk and check in, check out, and answering the phones, and like these things that really matter. And that's why like our coaching department, we feel is better off in her hands than it was in ours because of all of these things that she talks about. But like, we've never brought them up because that's not the way we think. And so you get the different set of eyes is really, really obvious here. I mean, there's things that she says that like you feel like you can do and improve in your practice tomorrow. And I think it's really cool. So Matt, is there anything else that we got to say before we get started on this one?
No, let's hit it.
All right, here we go with part two with our fake doc, Keith.
Welcome back to another episode of Practice Underwater. This is part 2 with our real doctor, whose fake name is Keith. Keith, how are you today?
I'm good. Thanks, Suzanne.
Awesome. So what I want to do here is kind of just give the audience a little bit of some key points that we had talked about last time, just as kind of a refresher. So can you kind of just bridge the gap here from last week in terms of some of the key points that you had told us about?
Sure. So I did a ground up startup 3.5 years ago. And we've grown steadily since then, been more successful than I could have anticipated. But for about the last year, I feel like I'm somewhat stuck at this kind of ugly duckling solo to group transition phase. Partly kind of self-inflicted because I'm having a tough time turning over the keys, both clinically and non-clinically, and just letting go a little bit.
And for our listeners, I'm sure many of you can really associate with that and are kind of maybe nodding your heads going, yeah, that is a definite stressor. Having a practice that is booming is definitely a great thing, but with that comes the additional stress of what do I do now, right? So as I look at your PBN, one of the things that many of the areas that I see actually don't lend itself to making yourself less busy. They actually lend itself to making yourself more busy. So you've already assessed the fact that an associate is needed yesterday. So how soon can that happen feasibly?
We're talking at the end of January, and I think realistically, I'm still 6 months away.
So here, hence the stress here of we recognize we need a doctor, and some of the areas that are very glaring for me have everything to do with making sure that we've got everybody in our fold. So one of the questions I didn't ask you last week was about the hygiene schedule. Do you feel like it stays full? Do you feel like there are some last minute changes that occur?
It stays relatively full. There's some last minute changes that occur, but overall, I think it's pretty solid. We're booked. I know for a fact we're booked too far out right now. I mean, a new patient can't get in through hygiene for 3 weeks or more.
So you're looking for everybody under the sun. You should just walk out there with a sandwich board, say, I'm looking for dental personnel. But honestly, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? I feel like the opportunity that you've grown the practice quite a bit. So let me just kind of give a little bit of context here. 2017 was when you did this startup. And when I'm looking, so for the listeners, when I'm looking at the patient-based numbers, we're at a little over 2,100. So we've got 2,100 patients that have been in at least once in the last 18 months. But what we do have is a leaky bucket when it comes to how many are actually seen ahead. And part of that is, fact of the matter, you need more hygiene hours as you've assessed. So we've got, if I were kind of to dissect the practice into, a couple of areas, we've got a facility-bound issue, which needs to occur, bringing on a doctor, bringing on a hygienist for sure. And then we also have a small window of opportunity to reconnect with some of these patients that are overdue for care. Now, if I look at last year's stats, knowing that that was a year where some patients pushed off their appointments, right? I still get a sense of how many you've seen in the last 6 months, which is that past that COVID period, and how many are appointed ahead. I see that the team keeps improving in that area. So it sounds like it's something that you guys have been talking about. Am I correct?
Yeah, we make a point to try to pre-appoint patients for hygiene, and then be proactive in getting those in that aren't scheduled.
Okay. So 2 out of the 3 of your hygienists, I feel like, do that on a higher level. There's 1 out of the 3 that isn't maybe as comfortable. And I wonder if that has everything to do with the communication, or is it just her seeing that her schedule is so booked out? And therefore it's kind of not a motivating factor. And so I feel like they juggle with, wow, our schedule is booked out so far. And, what do we do with the reality of this situation of having these patients that are kind of sitting there in limbo? Is it easy to get into another dental office in your area, or is it that remote?
No, it's not really remote. I'm not sure about availability at other offices, but there's 10 other general dentists within a 10-minute drive of me.
Okay. So, I'm not hating the stats on recall current. Honestly, I don't hate that area, but I feel like if we're going to continue to grow and we're going to have as many doctor days as we talked about in part 1, I feel like there's a disconnect here with us appointing ahead at the same value for recall patients as we are for our new patients. So let's talk proactive and reactive approach here a little bit. And this may hone in on the gap that you may be seeing with 1 out of the 3 hygienists is the team needs to have this true understanding of no one leaves without an appointment scheduled. And while, again, 2 of the 3 of the hygienists are doing this at a higher level, I feel like where the ball gets dropped tends to be on the doctor's schedule. So if whoever is assisting whichever doctor keeps that top of mind, us appointing ahead, even if we can't appoint ahead at that 6-month mark, even if it goes to that 7th-month mark, for example, you at least have that commitment with the patient and can say something like, Mr. Jones, should something become available sooner, we'll give you a call, but let's go ahead and reserve that appointment at that next possible spot. With such a huge part of the patient base that may not be appointed ahead, I feel like once the time comes, we're going to open up the ops, we're going to open up doctor time, we're going to have more hygiene time. Obviously that problem won't be appointing ahead in later than the time is actually due. But I want to start planting the seed in the minds of the team members that the assistants definitely have a part to play in that, as well as, all of the hygienists appointing ahead, because calling them after the fact is going to be pretty difficult in your case, right? Your bandwidth that's not possible at this point in time, which brings me to, what do we do up front in terms of them being stressed with as many providers as you have? Have you guys talked or even explored the opportunity of having another front office person?
We have not to this point.
Is there a concern about that, or is that just not something you guys have thought about?
I think they're getting close to being maxed. One of my front office team members could pick up a day a week to help us out a little bit there. But it's a lot to do for one person. It's a 2-person job at this point. And for us to take the next step, there probably should be 2 administrative people there every day we're open.
Okay, I definitely would agree. And what's happening now is they're both probably just putting out fires, making sure people are getting checked in, checked out, not necessarily honing in on anything that may be leaving or walking out the front door without, being appointed ahead. I feel like having someone in a patient care coordinator role, which would be in that checking in and checking out, maybe insurance verification if that's a possibility, but really just inviting patients back and making sure that someone has an eye on being the gatekeeper, for that opportunity. I think when I look at how many patients are actually out there that either have gone inactive or have left the practice in the last 12 months. And only because we're past that 12-month mark, if we've got about 600 patients that are considered in practice by numbers lost in the last 12 months, that's, almost a hygiene cycle if you look at that. But if we were to really be conservative about that and say, okay, we can get 100 of those back in, 100 times $100 if we're being super conservative in terms of a recare appointment. I mean, that's additional revenue. Now, I recognize that your pain is not saying we're not making, collection, or I'm not happy with our collections, or I'm not happy with our production. I do recognize that, but at the same time, there is revenue that we're leaving on the table here by not really maximizing. So from a proactive approach, I'd like the team to really be thinking about everybody that is working with a patient. What's my role in making sure they get appointed ahead, whether that's 7 months, 8 months, or we tell everybody basically if that's past that time frame that we'll let them know should something become available sooner. And then on the reactive side, having someone in place to make sure that bucket stays as small as possible, basically, to make sure that we're connecting and keeping the patients in the fold. You've worked so hard to do this startup, and you've got 2,000 patients. I'd hate to think there are that many that are in overdue status. So we talked about existing patients, and I am concerned about the new patients. So if I look at last year in practice by numbers, total last year, you welcomed about 700 patients, a little over 700 patients that were new. Does that sound right?
Yep.
Okay. About a little over 300 are actually not appointed ahead for any. So this is patients we just recently saw last year in the last 12 months from, January to December in that group. Those aren't appointed ahead for their next appointment. We've got about half of them, right? So if we're talking growth and we continue to want to support associates, then why do you think that leaky bucket on the new patient side happens? Any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure. I mean, obviously some of those patients are one and done emergency type patients. Other ones may have scheduled through our online scheduling portal and just think that gives them more control and convenience and want to do that again. And part of it's probably us not being as diligent about pre-appointing as we need to be.
Sure. And to be honest, many practices face this, like there's no motivation on the part of the front office team to make sure that we've closed the gaps on all of these areas, right? Because the schedule is booked out so far, so there's really nothing pressing. So I recognize that if you're spending any marketing dollars whatsoever on this, of course, you'd want to make sure that they come back. There's so many efforts that go into welcoming a new patient to the practice. So if I just hone in on January's data, as we come up on the end of the month here, we've seen 49 new patients in the practice, and 16 of those left without an appointment scheduled. So that patient care coordinator, I feel like, is a crucial position in your practice because they'll make sure the existing patients are coming back and the new patients. And if anybody new is not coming back, then we're going to know why immediately, as opposed to waiting 6 months, trying to reconnect after the fact, which is so much harder. So I'm kind of pushing you into that, proactive mode in every sense of the word, just being prepared with, we've got someone up front, hygiene, of course, you're looking, associate, you're looking, but I feel like when that time comes, we'll have that system and that strategy in place so that all of these things just roll naturally, right? Switching gears here a little bit on another of the opportunities that I see, which again, doesn't lend itself to being less busy, but it is a fact of the matter is you've probably noticed a lower value per patient than you've probably heard us talk about on podcasts, right? Tell me a little bit about that.
We're a PPO practice. I feel like, among other reasons, part of the reason that new patients come to us is because we take their insurance, or we're in network with their insurance, which maybe says they're a little more price conscious. And part of it's probably a problem in our own heads, projecting our thoughts on patients' financial situations and pocketbooks. And then just clinically, I'm not a real aggressive treatment planner. So there's probably some room for, just more opportunities there, just with more elective, proactive treatment than reactive treatment.
Mm-hmm. So I think you're comfortable with the obvious, and I think your associate is as well, right? I almost want you to start to become, here's kind of a challenge for the both of you, start to become comfortable with a few no's. And I say that because you've got a high ratio of patient acceptance. So for our listeners, 93% of the patients that are being given a treatment plan say yes to something, which in my opinion is a high ratio. Now, we can look at this as something to celebrate, or look at it as a way to say, okay, how about if we pushed ourselves a little more and started to look at things that just aren't obvious, and being okay with less patient acceptance, if you will. Now, your treatment acceptance is also almost 50%. So when I look at that, while that sounds great, your average treatment presented is in the $600, right? So a lot of your patients are being told they need some basic restorative, and that level of what you're getting acceptance on is pretty high on that end as well. A lot of your patients are accepting your recommendations for basic restorative care. But what about when you, again, like we said, the elective part, or the parts that are even restorative major? I feel like your associate really deserves your mentoring. So for you to be able to mentor the associate in that way, you've got to be comfortable with this as well in your own mind, if you're going to be the coach to your associate, right? And so I want to encourage you by saying your patients obviously love what you're saying. They agree. There's a high level of trust there. And, this is a difficult conversation for me to have, and for our listeners to know that, I'm not a dentist. So I'm not the one who's going to say, hey, think outside the box, or, hey, you're not doing enough dentistry. What I am saying is this is low in comparison to the offices I coach and the offices that we see. And so I want you to know that this is on the lower side, and that's basically just a fact. But what we do with this information then becomes the next step, right? You're diagnosing on many patients, like 50% of the time, patients need some kind of care. And that care that's being delivered tends to be, just from the numbers, right, tends to be smaller dollar values. So as I kind of send the ball your way, tell me how you feel about that.
Again, I think the truth is always somewhere in between. So part of that is probably that our demographic is a relatively young and healthy demographic. But also part of that is, like I said, us maybe not being as proactive on diagnosing the asymptomatic cracked tooth, things like that, opportunities like that we're leaving on the table. Or, hey, this molar has something obviously wrong with it, but the adjacent teeth have things that, if we want to be proactive, could be fixed. So now instead of a single tooth, we're doing a whole quadrant. There's opportunity like that, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we know the value of that, right? Not having the patient come back for multiple appointments means less chair time, and you're strapped for chair time right now, so that may be a better opportunity.
I was just sitting down to record some of my experiences with dentist advisors to share with you when I got a call from a good friend of mine who has a ton of financial questions and is uncertain about the future. has some money. He invested it at a time when the market was uncertain and saw some returns. But now he's uncertain of what he should do with that money in order to protect it moving forward and continue to grow it. So I told him, we've been talking about dentist advisors for a long time, and he knows and trusts them. It's like, this is the perfect time to engage in a full relationship with dentist advisors. When the markets are up and down, when you don't know what to do with your money, this is when you need a financial advisor so that you can stop worrying and start living the life that you want to live right now. So do what I did this week, which was have my first call with dentist advisors. Now, not only do I have a plan for myself, but I have a team who's going to help me evaluate the key areas of my financial health every month and help me build and adjust my plan as circumstances change. So if you're ready to have a custom plan built for you and direct access to an advisor in these uncertain times, go to dentistadvisors.com and click the book free consultation button to sign up for a call. Once again, go to dentistadvisors.com and click the book a free consultation link today.
Now, you mentioned you have 3 assistants, and on the days where you don't have an associate, do you still have all 3 of them there?
I do not. I just have 2.
Okay. So at least if you've got 2 at the very least, you can, kind of have this dovetail schedule where you can have a smaller procedure besides something that's a great stopping point for you. And so with as many, here's kind of the disconnect that I have. With as many hygiene patients as you have coming through the hygiene side, what I don't see a whole lot of is your schedule being booked out really far. And you would think that with as many patients as you're seeing, as many exams as you're doing, that would fill your schedule. When I look at your schedule in PBN, I can see that you're not necessarily booked out as far as not even a week, right? So that tells me those numbers are kind of lining up for me to say, okay, so you're doing these shorter filling appointments, which is really, between us and the audience, it's really causing you some greater stress than you need to, because these small appointments back to back just means more room turnover and more people at the front, and you're nodding your head like you totally get what I'm saying, right? So, how can we make it such that it works for the patient because it's easier for them to come in once, and it works for you guys because it's easier for you to see this patient once, as opposed to, having 100 patients that day on your side, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. A horrendous day for me is when I have 8 or 10 patients scheduled in 4 hours in the afternoon, and I'm running around like a crazy man and also trying to check 2 or 3 hygienists. So streamlining those things or scheduling appropriately, and then I'm able to do better exams too, because quite honestly, when I'm running around seeing 8 or 10 patients in half a day on my side, my exams and my thoroughness there is suffering.
I completely agree. And then you look at the day end report, you look at your production for that day, and what do? You feel totally deflated, right? Because you said, I know I worked harder than this. So that definitely is, is a very real issue. Now, how can we help you with exams so that when you go in, things are teed up? Do you and your hygienists that would be one thing that I would recommend, is if you spend some time with your hygienists, coaching them as you coach the associate on what to be looking for, and them having it all teed up for you really will reduce your exams, but make them more productive in terms of the time that you spend with the patient, because you're not having to dig into all of the different areas. And you're not just, basically looking at the obvious broken tooth or cracked filling or, whatever that may be. Tell me about that. Are you guys using any tools like an intraoral camera, scanner?
We have an intraoral camera that we use very regularly. I think you're right. Me just finding time to coach the hygienists and have that treatment teed up for me so my exams can be thorough yet efficient would be helpful. Because the hygienists know how busy I am oftentimes, and they know my exams need to be quick. But yeah, I think just getting on the same page with them and coaching them and talking to them about what I need when I walk in the room, and that most of the diagnoses have already been made, discussed, maybe a rough outline of a treatment plan would be helpful.
Mm-hmm. So many hygienists will use their intraoral camera at the end of the session. And I feel like if they do all of the diagnostics at the beginning, it didn't matter if you were to do your exams midway through or at the end. Is that something you do, a mid-hygiene check?
Yep. We've
Good.
tried to make a point of doing that. It just gives them and me more freedom.
Yeah, they will love you more. I will tell you, not having to wait for you at the end. And, it never works out at the end, right? So it being a time that works, that's convenient for you. So if we were to say, okay, these are the pieces of data that we need prior to that exam. So prior, like within the first 10 to 15 minutes of the appointment, you can go in anytime after that, like 15 after, let's just say. And then you have those pieces either up or easily accessible. And then you're asking a simple question like, hygienist, tell me about Mrs. Jones today. That helps tee them up to, okay, this is what we've been talking about. Here's the outstanding treatment that you recommended last time. Take a look at that, doctor. We need you to reevaluate that. You guys are now really making that time that you have with the patient as productive as it can be. And I feel like that will help you make that exam time valuable, for both the patient and for yourself.
As we grow from 3 to 4 to 5 hygienists and perhaps beyond, is there a point where you advocate for having a doctor there that is solely doing exams while the other doctor or doctors are doing operative specifically, and kind of segregating those duties?
That's not necessarily a typical mode, and I'm not all about typical, but I will say, how does compensation happen there? That's always my question. Because typically when you are diagnosing with a patient and you're actually feeding that into your schedule, patient is expecting you to do the work or the associate to do the work most of the time. I feel like that's a great question, but it's not something that I usually recommend, only because how do we make it work financially for that doctor?
Okay, thanks.
Right. So we talked about how do we increase our average treatment presented. And then a byproduct of that is, do you feel comfortable that the team gets it accepted? So if you increase on one side, are we going to get yeses from patients on the other side because you've got that team support? Or, is there training needed, in your opinion, on that area as well? Because they've been used to treatment planning fillings.
There's probably some training needed to step up and take us to the next level. I think all of us, to some extent, don't like being rejected. But being okay with no's, or how to maybe convert the waffling patient to a yes, is an area that we could use a little help in.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So having someone comfortable in that treatment planning spot, we talked about my ideal for your practice being 3 people up front, right? And if we have someone in the patient care coordinator role, we've got someone primarily doing those treatment plans. The more of these you do, the more comfortable you become. And of course, having someone that believes in your dentistry and is able to convey that belief, and then having financial arrangements if value is built chairside, and all the value comes from the back, either I'm a hygiene patient, I'm in the recare side, or I'm on your side as either a new or existing patient. If value is built there, what the front office team does is just make sure the patient can comfortably afford that. So their job up front is to find a way to make this happen. And so someone who believes in your dentistry can often speak. And then if we've got some financial ways to make it comfortable for them to pay for, the dentistry that they need, then that should be a slam dunk. But again, having someone there in that role that's really comfortable and believes in your dentistry and is able to convey that belief and gets excited about what you're recommending, that kind of comes full circle. So you start to see these larger appointments in your schedule, which really help decompress a lot of this like very small running around, right? You can kind of breathe in between those appointments. And you kind of leading the ship there, mentoring the associate, I think you're giving this associate, whether he or she stays with you for the rest of their career or moves on, you're giving them a pretty solid base to grow from at that point. So, you talked about mentorship. I love that part of it. I think part of you being a mentor is doing all of this that we're talking about yourself to be able to say, okay, look, this works. We just have to make sure that we're really even more of a cohesive team than we actually already are. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Now, typically at this point, like we've talked about some areas, like I said, that don't necessarily make you less busy, and we don't have one of those like magic wands that we can say this is going to fix, quote unquote, the issue right now, because we do need some support, doctor time and hygiene time and front office time. But another reason why I feel strongly about having another person up front is at this point, our AR is out of whack. So small appointments, but yet a very high AR. Tell me that story.
We do in-office financing, which, allows patients to spread payments over several months, which might lend itself to some of that. And part of it is probably, like you said, the front office team just trying to keep their head above water, answering the phone, checking patients in. Meanwhile, others are scooting out the door without paying balances, etc.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening. Is there's so much to do when the phone is ringing and a patient is checking in or checking out, that it's kind of easier to just say, Mrs. Jones, we'll just bill your insurance and we'll send you a statement after that, right? So I'm definitely not opposed to in-office arrangements, but I am opposed to not having a strategy. I mean, this is basically an area that I think I'm seeing about twice your production level in either the insurance pocket or the patient's pocket, and I'd love for it to be in your pocket. Right? So if we've got someone at the front, an additional body up there handling some of the tasks like recare, like confirmations, like some of the day-to-day things that absolutely have to happen, because AR, in my opinion, is an easy thing to put aside. It's kind of like it's out of sight, out of mind, one of those things that I have to make time for. And if it's not something that's done regularly, most offices will say, oh, I come in on this day and I'll do this for half a day. Well, that could be this month, that could be a month and a half, right? How often do we actually have that much time where someone can devote to that, especially them being too upfront? So I'd like to say, and honestly, this is where our coaches excel when this strategy is implemented in a way that reduces or sprinkles the time throughout a month. So if you're working on a few areas, but you're doing it strategically every single week, the calls that may come in with questions from patients are sprinkled out throughout the month. So you're not necessarily having to have this crazy like, oh, I have to devote all this time, and then these patients are calling asking about questions. The other thing that should be happening, if it's not, as soon as we get an insurance check and we're posting an insurance check, let's send a statement. That's at least one thing that you can do that will make a difference if the team isn't already doing that. Like, let's send the statement out right away. But going forward, if there are clear financial arrangements, so the coaches that are, our coaches listen to the Practice Underwater as well, and the coaches are going to be giggling when they hear me say this. When I do coach training, I always say, okay, back up to the beginning of that source. What is the issue from the perspective of if we add more treatment, higher dollar value. They have to be comfortable with making that clear financial arrangement, right? Making sure that the patient is clear on exactly what their investment is going to look like and how that's going to be paid. And us knowing that as well, so that we're fully aware. Because if we're not today, when the patient comes in and there's an outstanding balance, we're helping them incur more debt, but we're not helping them take care of that previous balance, right? So again, there are some areas here of opportunity that I feel like some training with the team members would really benefit from, but having someone that's really on top of this, as opposed to just, oh, when I have time, I'll do this.
Yeah, I think the holes in the bucket on the front administrative side has kind of been something my eyes have been open to now, because I obviously feel more of it on the back end. Clinically, I know we need another hygienist. I know we need another doctor. I know we probably need another assistant soon. But some of these things that are slipping through the cracks on the front end obviously need to be addressed as well.
Absolutely. And I think putting these strategies that we talked about today, putting those in place sooner rather than later, because you're going to have more providers if we've got those systems down pat. Then from an infrastructure standpoint, we're building upon that. And there will be less chaos as we go forward. But again, I want to encourage you to make your schedule, be more proactive when it comes to making your schedule a little lighter by not having you bogged down with all these little appointments. But I want to, stress here that when I look at your schedule, I don't see it booked out that far. So there is an opportunity for changing on your side. And you may be bogged down with doing some of the other management things in the practice that you don't even notice, maybe that your schedule is a little lighter than I'd like to see it.
Sure.
Okay. Because you probably are trying to do everything that you're kind of saying, oh, okay, I'm hoping that my schedule opens up a little bit.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. When a patient cancels, it's a gift.
Well, we're not in the medical field, right? We're in the dental field, so that's different.
Right.
All right. And, one takeaway is, and I want the audience to hear this as well, for me, is be comfortable with the no, because the no is an opportunity for you to be, to really learn and to really be challenged with, it's okay that not everybody's going to say yes, right? But we just have to be okay with that. So make it such that what you're doing is, and know that what you're doing is easier on the patient as well as yourself, right? Nobody wants to come in 2 or 3 times, or every time they have an appointment, there's a new filling that has to be done, right? And that isn't necessarily in what the patient wants. It's not in their best interest either. So challenges out there. Okay.
All right.
Awesome.
Fair enough.
What questions do you have for me, Keith?
No, you've been helpful. Obviously, some of the problems I knew were happening, maybe being a little reactive. And you kind of brought up some of the areas that we could be more proactive on, which has been helpful for me going forward, and will probably ease a little bit of the pain, because I've been feeling the pain for 6 months now, and probably will be for a little longer. So I think just identifying problems before they become painful, just like our patients need to, will save me a lot of trouble.
Well, please keep in touch so that we know how that's going. Okay. Awesome.
I will.
Thank you so much for being a guest on Practice Underwater. And we look forward to our next episode next week. Thanks, Keith.
Thank you.
All right. Welcome back. I hope you guys enjoyed that interview. And Matt, what did you think?
Well, that was our fake doc, Keith. I think, George, you meant the fake name, Keith.
It's been so long since I've done one of these that I missed. It's real doc, fake name, Keith.
Wow.
That's the way I always say it.
It's big. It's been that long you forget your own tagline. That's a bad sign.
Well, the reason it stuck, it wasn't like, I invent things as I talk. Like I usually don't know what I'm saying until I've already said it. And I was doing that one time and I said, real doc, fake name. And then I said whatever it was. And then you go, oh, that's brutal. And I told John, I'm like, John, keep that in there. Keep the that's brutal in there. I was like, man, okay, we've gotta go back. And then every time since then, I have said that because I knew. And then eventually you started saying it.
I just think that phrase is terrible, and you need to erase it from your vocab. And you my promise to listeners, you'll never hear me say that.
But you took the thing that was brutal grew on you, and that's a very common quality.
It's like the George Costanza. You get stuck in their head. That's Seinfeld guy, so you don't get that. But
yeah, so I don't get that. I'm not a Seinfeld guy, but I'm annoying enough to know that I say the annoying things over and over again. Like, it's not hard, it's uncomfortable, or I have like these little like zingy things that I say all the time, and I repeat in conversations, kind of like a broken record, and then people start saying them too. And so, real doc, fake name Keith. There we go.
There you go.
So,
all right.
Yeah, I know you had thoughts. I'll kind of let you. This is backwards, right? Normally, I'm the one firing away with my things that I want to nitpick.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have an acknowledgement for Suzanne, and I'm really excited to bring it. I think I'm really glad this came up because I think and I'm just guessing, maybe a confusion of people who are dentists and are thinking about being coached by an office manager. They're like, how am I going to get coached on clinical things? And I think this is a great window in how Suzanne and our coaching department does it, where like she points out the metrics that are low and she states facts. And she says this, like, your average diagnosis is low compared to other users and other clients of this software. And I thought she handled that beautifully. And with that, she didn't get into nitty gritty of like, you need to diagnose more, you need to do more, crowns versus fillings and all this stuff. But like, she stated the facts, and he can take that and use what he wants. And if he wants more like, strategies actually like to action on, he takes that into Mastermind and talks with other docs about, how he could diagnose differently.
So it was really cool because as this conversation was coming up, I was like, oh, let's see how she handles this. And so this is something we talk about in coach training, because obviously, right, our former office manager coaches are looking at dashboards and like, look, let's just be honest for a minute. We can tell who diagnoses well and who doesn't off of a dashboard. Like an office manager can tell that, a dentist can tell that. This isn't rocket science. Like the fact that I'm a dentist doesn't make me that much more qualified to look at a dashboard and compare diagnoses between dentists. Like we look at the diagnosis percentage, we look at the average treatment plan size, average treatment plan accepted. We look at the diversity. We look for crown hunters. We look for people that are heavily restorative basic. We look at people that are crown to filling ratios. Like with the amount of metrics we have, in like 30 seconds, we pretty much know who they are diagnostically. As dentists, when we do these interviews, we just call them out. Like we don't give them the grace of like we're a dentist. I can tell you, like, dude, like, come on. Like, there's no way I'm in your practice and this is happening, but with Suzanne, it's an office manager, a non-dentist, you have to be careful. And so this is something we really harp on coach training. And what we teach them is we say, you always are polite to the dentist. You never, ever overstep, but you just present them with the facts and you want to show them their percentile because their percentile doesn't lie. Mm-hmm. And this guy's likely in the 10 to 25th percentile of his average treatment plan size. So typically when we have a client, 1,500 is kind of like what I would say is like average for our client pool, not for all people, but for our client pool, 1,500 is kind of average. And then 2,000 plus, my practice, we typically operate 2,200 to 2,300 per treatment plan.
And that's average case presentation.
Yeah. And he's 600 something, she said. Like, I mean, she has to bring that up. That's like, and like, right, he's not productive. He's underperforming. His hygiene schedule is booked out. And then she goes, I love how she pulls up his doctor schedule. She's like, there's a bunch of like small appointments there and you're not booked out that far. And like, she's trying to tiptoe around the very obvious fact that this is a major issue in his practice. And then like to hear the excuse of like, it's my area. It's like, I just want to say for everyone that doesn't know my population, I practice in a very young, affluent community where people take great care of their teeth long term. And I mean, we have a lot of clients that practice in that young PPO demographic. There are a lot of things you can do, like Invisalign or, there's so much occlusal guards. Like there isn't this, I will not accept that as an excuse.
No, that's a hot button issue for me of like a client telling me about their demographic as an excuse for why their diagnosis is terrible. Like that.
And we're not saying do things your patients don't need. Like I've been slammed on another podcast for this, for this conversation on air, but like, I'll say it again and I'll get slammed again for it. But like, We're not telling anyone to diagnose anything the patient doesn't need. Like, just let's start there. But like when we look at a dentist, and if we look at 100 offices and they're in the bottom 20 on diagnosing, like, we are not their fiduciary if we are not mentioning this, right? And what we say is, hey, look, 100 dentists, I don't like. I tell clients the same thing. I do not get in clinical conversations with my clients at all.
Really?
Not, wow. I do not like to go there. No. And if they ask a specific question, I will give them a specific answer. So sometimes, like, and people, Matt, you've heard me talk clinical off air, and like, I can clinically hold my own. I'm a dentist. Like,
I'm surprised by that, because I mean, I obviously don't shy away from those conversations, and I love having them.
I do not have them with clients at all. And so what I'll tell them, like, if I had the diagnosis conversation, I actually handle it the same way Suzanne does. I say, look, I'm not going to tell you how to diagnose. I don't like when people tell me how to diagnose. And I think that was part of the issue, is when I had a coaching relationship with a dentist, he was telling me all the time how to diagnose. And I was like, dude, like, that's not how we're going to grow my practice. Like, I will not do it that way. And it was kind of a hot button for me. So I don't go there with clients, but I always say, like, look, you're in this percentile. Like, I'm just telling you, you're probably leaving a lot on the table. Like, that's just factual. And so I love the way she handled it. And then this is where what we treat the coaches is you make them aware of the issue. You show them compared to other offices where their, types of treatment that they're diagnosing are. And she made it very clear, restorative major, right? Crowns are what's being underdiagnosed compared to other offices, right? And it's for up to him, the dentist, to look in that. And he said, we don't treat asymptomatic cracked teeth. So it's like, that's kind of your reason right there. And then also you have, and then after that, right? Like, after we do that, we usually will have the coach communicate with their pod leader and mastermind and say, like, blank has some diagnosis issues. So, take a look at that and see if there's anything you find in there. And that's typically how we handle that type of workflow, because this is the biggest issue that comes up in a non-dentist being a coach. And so that's sort of how we've instructed our teams to handle it. So I thought she did it wonderfully.
No, I totally agree. And the other areas that they talked at that, and then this is where Suzanne brought up something that I wasn't even thinking of, that his need for another front desk, a third at the front, and pointing to his AR issues as part of the reason for that. Some of the recare overdue also a reason for that. And I thought it was brilliant how she maneuvered that conversation, because as he's growing into more of a group, he will need that third person up there. And I think to front load that, especially as he's so hesitant to drop clinical days, that will really kind of move him forward. And just a piece for the Keith, if you're listening back, you can keep that in-house financing off of your AR in a way you input it into your software. Because I'm looking at the AR, it's high not because
how many days?
It's 56 days.
Yeah. So I do an office financing, and I'm at like 24 days.
Yeah, that's not a reason, and that's an area he went to as defense for why it was high, and that's just based on our experience, that's very, very unlikely. That's the reason it's that high.
Yeah, unless he's just financing an abnormal amount.
Yeah.
But and again, I think this is where we talked about the excuses in part one, and like we won't reharp on those again. But I mean, you can, and this is where it's nice to have like access to the practice management software, so you can just like label, and he can just say, oh, blank amount of that is like every month I get a report from my office manager about how much we have financed out, and then we subtract that from our AR and we calculate our true AR days, and we kind of do everything like that. So it'd be good if he had that level of control over it.
Yeah. What else do you have?
I mean, I think that's what I got. I mean, I think it was really cool. I just, the thing that I keep going back to is, how much, and it's like, he's just got to drop his days. Like, that's the biggest thing. You got to drop your days. All of this stuff, like his practice can, and that's what we're saying. Like, this is like, you get mad at me for saying that it's a straightforward doubling of a practice when you got way more new patients than you can see, and you're underdiagnosing, as an office, like statistically, not any particular type of dentistry. Like, that's like the easiest type of practice to double. Like, we have the hardest ones to double when we don't have the patient flow. Those are the hardest. When we have adequate patient flow, like you heard Katie, like a few weeks ago on Practice Underwater, she started at 45, and 6 months later she did 136. Like, that's a triple. And like, this isn't like that complex. You just need to do the uncomfortable things of cutting your days and letting go of the control and it's not hard, it's uncomfortable. There's a lot of discomfort ahead of him, but there's not a lot of difficulty in actually executing. It's just a discomfort. And that's where I think the coaching really helps, of holding people accountable and, like ensuring, like, okay, Matt, is he more likely to double this practice in 12 months on his own?
No, definitely not.
Yeah, right. Like, there's no way. And that's the whole point, is like, you can do it. It might take him 2.5 years. It might take us 12 months, but this is a doubleable practice. Yeah. Easy.
There's so much meat on the bone here. There's so much opportunity. There's, this is extremely straightforward. I really encourage this person, have the conversation of what it would look like to coach with us. Cause this practice looks totally different with our help.
Yeah, definitely. Anyway, and I think you see why now, right? Like, look at Suzanne. Like, she actually, you can tell that we actually implement now, right? Like, she knows like how to hire and train and all of these things, and teaching that to our team. Like, it's really cool to have you guys see that side of it, because that's the side we've been talking about on air that you haven't seen on air. And the mindset stuff will follow. We and she will get the cadence of how to do the practice underwater interviews fully. But I hope you guys got more out of this one than different things than you probably have gotten before. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys next week. We're committed to this format, and so we'll keep going with it, and we'll kind of get better over time. I'm excited.